With me today I have Dr. David Monkton, and David is going to give us a survey of how the Eucharist is viewed within contemporary Methodism. You're very welcome to us here today here in Nottingham.
Thank you very much, Tom.
David, the Eucharist in contemporary Methodism, can you give us an insight into its place?
I think we have to bear in mind that all churches, of course, evolve and move from where they were originally. I think what one needs to say first of all is that the ministers who are presiding at the communion will probably all have their own slant on how they understand it. That's accepted.
There's always as many theologies as there are ministers.
That's true. Yes, yeah. Well, obviously, we have moved away, I think, in many parts of Methodism from what we might call the pure sacramental understanding of communion. It is still sacramental, of course, but not so much emphasis upon certain aspects that we find, for instance, in the early hymns of Wesley. And I think we start first of all by bearing in mind that some of the modern hymn writers have written some really good hymns on the communion, on the Eucharist, but there are certain elements that seem to have changed direction.
Okay.
And I think one of the main things is that a lot of ministers, congregations are very nervous about the penal substitution theory of the atonement. You know, they feel that there's something that isn't quite right here. It's not true of all ministers, of course, but this has meant that in many modern forms of communion, that the element of the atonement isn't expressed as such. It's more the idea of a fellowship meal with Christ that's still there.
And of course that's a movement that's taking place right across the whole sweep of Christian churches.
Yes, it is. And personally I think it's a mistake because people automatically think of penal substitution as being the atonement. And there's far more to it than that, isn't there, really? There are some very positive understandings of the atonement and that need looking at as well.
So in removing the whole notion of penal substitution, they're often losing the whole notion of the atonement as well.
I personally think that's a danger, and that worries me a bit, actually. And alongside that, there are three schools of thought, I suppose. There are people who will use the traditional services regularly. We normally do use the full book, the offices of the church, but we're not bound to. And there are those who will take the communion service extemporally, without any service book at all, a few. And there are then other people who will design their own orders of communion, and you get people, organisations like the Iona community who have their forms of communion. And what tends to happen in the Iona forms, and a lot of the forms that people write themselves, is that they identify the brokenness of Christ on the cross with the brokenness of humanity. And now, there's nothing wrong with this. I think it's good to relate it in this way. And also, I think there's an avoidance of the use of the word sin as well, very often in most services. And again, there's a hymn that the first line begins, "An upper room did our Lord prepare." The name of the writer I can't think of at the moment, but he lived to be over 100 years old and wrote a lot of these hymns in his supernumerary period as a minister. But he was very concerned that the whole field of communion shouldn't be monopolised by fundamentalism. And so he took along his hymns along this line of the communion being a fellowship of people with Christ. They noticed what had happened to Christ himself. and they see in his brokenness on the cross the brokenness of humanity. And also, in that hymn, he expresses the thought that that in our celebration of the Christian life, we are servants, and our serving, washing each other, Christ washed the disciples' feet, that kind of service is sacramental in itself. And so the communion is also a means of us beginning on our march outward, as it were, from the service that we celebrate together.
So in contemporary celebrations in Methodism, we have an emphasis on the meal as the gathering of the community.
Yes, yeah.
The community seeing its brokenness in terms of the brokenness of Christ.
Yes, yeah.
But also the meal is somehow a preparation for service.
I think that would be how many people would sum it up. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
You mentioned foot washing, because
Yes.
of course foot washing is the great command that the Christian churches never really took up. There's
Yes.
the command to baptize, there's the
Yes.
command do this in
Yes,
memory,
yeah, yes.
but there is the command wash one another's feet. Is foot washing connected with the Eucharist in contemporary Methodist practice?
Within some circles, yes. Very limited, I think.
Okay.
Yes. But I think we've also been influenced a great deal by the fact that there has been a convergence of all branches of Christianity, really, to a common consensus of thought on many of these things. And the Lima document was one that influenced Methodism a lot.
Right. So the great Lima document, which is now 30 years old,
Yes.
was actually was that one of the spurs to reform and renewal within Methodism?
Yes, I mean, I suppose when I was a teenager, that was when Methodists started to value their communion again. You know, it got very slack for about 70 or 80 years, I think,
Right.
and it was often tacked onto the end of the morning service or evening service, and just a few very faithful stewards would be there. But then all of a sudden, partly because of things like Lima and other influences I'll mention in a moment, it became central again, and it is now practiced by far more Methodists than there used to be at one time.
Okay.
I mean, there's still an old school of thought amongst some. I won't go very often,
Okay.
and even some who think that the communion is Catholic and they won't go. You know, there's a few odd
Yes.
people like this.
And of course, what this is the liturgical renewal movement,
Yes,
which
yeah.
has been going on for well over 100 years, now affecting Methodism.
Very much. Oh, yes.
You mentioned that there were other influences apart from Lima. Would you like to?
Yes. Well, there was the whole situation between the Methodist and the Anglican churches, the unity schemes.
Yes.
When these schemes were at their highest peak, obviously Methodism felt it was time that it started to look at its services more, and we produced some new services. Little booklet that I've got there, I call it the Anglican 2+ service. You know, just somewhere in between various things that they were doing at the same time. But we did look at a lot of our services in that way and see ways in which we had our roots in common with the Anglican churches. Although
the liturgical movement has had an impact. The ecumenical movement is in the Lima document, and the rediscovery of links with Anglicanism, and they are all refocusing Methodism on the Eucharist.
I think so. Yes, yes.
David, thank you very much for coming and talking to us.
That's a pleasure, Tom. Thank you.
Thank you.